Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Scribe in conversation with, and tonight we're in conversation with Cmpsr2000. Cmpsr2000 is a musician, composer, streamer, Twitch staff member, and co-owner of Sword and Board LLC. Also the publisher of The Dying Sun by L.J. Stanton. From an early age, he had aspirations to become a film scorer, leading him to pursue a degree in music composition. However, due to economic realities, he began a career as a software engineer after college. He studied with renowned composers George Crumb, Mauricio Cajal, Charles Norman Mason, and John Williams. Now Cmpsr2000 applies his passion for music as a part of the Twitch music organization, while occasionally continuing to write music in his spare time. This is what I was talking about when I said he is a true Renaissance man. There's so many things that he does. So welcome, Composer. Welcome tonight. I hope I can call you Composer, not Cmpsr2000.
Yes, please call me Composer. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you for joining tonight. This is fantastic. So there's a lot in your bio that came up. There's a lot.
I gave you the Cliff Notes version too. That is not a lot compared to the entire history of my career, I believe.
That's fantastic, and that's what we kind of want here. Is we like to have interesting conversations with this, and the more involved you are in life, I think the more interesting life is. So it's nice to meet someone else that, I don't know if you've purposely set out to be a Renaissance man. You've kind of landed on your feet in this situation.
Yeah, in my case, I'd say it's a side effect of having ADHD, right? Like if you can't focus on one thing for too long of a time, you end up learning a whole lot of different. And so, in my case, that definitely has had an impact. But in general, I wouldn't say that I set out explicitly to be a Renaissance man, but I did set out explicitly to never stop learning. Right? I don't really think of school as being the time and place where you learn. I really kind of think of life as being that space. And my approach to life is generally, I don't know everything. I have plenty to learn. What can I learn today? And I've had a lot of opportunities over the years to basically take on new challenges and do new things.
That's fantastic. And that is something that I agree with. That's something my father-in-law says all the time. And my wife and I say all the time as well, is never-ending learning. Whenever you learn something new. But that's it. The school isn't the end of learning. You always, to quote the movie Waking Life, you always need to be in a constant state of departure while consistently arriving at your destination. You need to keep learning and trying to pick up new things, and that's what makes life interesting. And being a writer, that's that's what it does. It's one of my favorite jokes is the thing of like, when did you learn about astrophysics? Well, last night. Because you need to research things, you need to know things. So with this, there is a lot. We're going to cover a lot of this stuff that you have listed in your bio here. But one of the things I wanted to say is that another reason why I'm excited about this conversation that we're having tonight is because, as I'm sure many people in my stream have heard, I've been saying for quite a while, almost a year now on my stream, that I am in awe of composers. I've worked with composers. I've got to meet a lot of different composers and a lot of different classical musicians. And I'm a writer. I can work with words. I can make words dance and sing and do different things. But to work with music and to write music, it's writing. It's a different form of writing, but it is so much different. And it's such a fascinating thing for me. And so it's great to be able to actually have a conversation on stream with someone who is a composer and has studied music intensively and can kind of shed some light on the aspects of composing music and show us how it is a form of writing, but a very much different form of writing.
Absolutely. It's interesting because the way that you say that, what you have said is it's a very common opinion, I find, when I talk to other people. If I tell them I write music, it's all like, oh, wow, that's so creative. That's so interesting. That's like, how do you even do that? And realistically, having done that a lot in my life and having done a lot of other things, I think of it the same way that I think of any new skill. Anybody, I think, can learn to write music. Music works on a series of rules, just like math does, just like, writing even works on a set of rules. you at some point have to put letters together to make sounds, right? So even though style can be very unique for each writer, the basic approach of putting words to paper is a skill that can be learned in practice. And it's the same way with writing music. You have to start from you know, a space of honesty, though. When you start any new skill, you know nothing about that skill, and you need to, invest time, effort, energy into learning how to do it. Now, in my case, I started writing, I think when I was about 15, 16 years old. And I remember my father actually bought a computer program for my mother that would let her basically write out some of her piano parts to transpose things so that she wouldn't have to do it in her head. And I ended up just pulling it up and just playing around, putting notes in random places and pressing play and seeing what happened. Now, I grew up in a musical family, so I already kind of knew enough about kind of the structure of music to where that was enough to kind of get me hooked into the whole idea of, oh, I can create my own music. And it just kind of grew from there. But I definitely started at a place of not knowing what the heck I was doing and just literally dragging and dropping notes from a toolbar in a Windows program onto a staff and pressing play to see how it sounded. Be like, no, that's not the sound I'm looking for. I'm looking for another sound. And then as I became more educated, I was able to learn why those sounds were good and why they worked. And that essentially enabled me to take shortcuts when I wrote music, to where I didn't have to just experiment essentially by, dropping things onto a page and see what stuck. I could instead think about the sound I wanted in my head essentially and use the knowledge and the skills I had learned to put it down on paper. Um, so in that sense, for me, it was a very real skill that I learned slowly over time. And I got a lot of help from a lot of people, a lot of very good composers, writers, orchestrators over the years, imparted their skills onto me, and that has helped me improve. I don't really consider myself a professional composer. I don't do it for money. I do it for fun. I never really got a chance to sort of dive in and do it professionally. That's not completely true. I've scored a film before, and I have scored a couple of I guess you'd call them vignettes, like areas in a video game, essentially. And I can go into that part of my my history at some point if you'd like. But I never did it for money, right? And so I still consider myself an amateur, despite the fact that I've learned a whole lot, and I feel like I probably could be successful as a professional if I, you know, switched gears and focused on it, right? But again, it becomes like a skill. You just have to practice.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I gotta say, I kind of feel attacked when you said that there's rules in writing. I mean, that's uncomfortable. But no, so
So that's the great thing, though, right? Like as an artist, you can choose what rules to follow and what rules to break, and ultimately, that's what creates art, right?
that is, yeah.
The so rules are derivative from the artwork, is a good way to think of it. So in music, that's called music theory, right? Somebody writes a piece of music, some other person comes around, analyzes the piece of music, and comes up with theories about why the music sounds the way it does, why it works the way it does. And then people then turn those theories into rules, which can be used as shortcuts to compose future pieces of music or to analyze future pieces of music. But no two pieces of music are ever the same. They never follow the exact same pattern, right? But there are still some basic rules to learn, like the idea of a time signature is a basic rule in music, right?
Yeah.
So, and there are there's plenty of music written that doesn't necessarily follow a time signature. So you don't necessarily have to use that rule just because it exists. And
Sometimes
it's the
that
same
can
with
make it more interesting.
yes,
Breaking that
absolutely,
rule.
exactly. So it's the where you choose to follow rules and break rules is what adds interest and style to your art. But
Yeah.
ultimately, you can think of it as if you were a painter, you're learning about how colors work together and how paint works on the canvas and how you combine all that knowledge in order to result in a finished piece. And you can choose to use or not use any piece of that knowledge when composing a painting, right? It works the same for most art, as far as at least the arts that I've tried myself. like photography, like even the way your image looks is called composition,
Hmm.
right? Ultimately, there's an element of composition to most art forms.
And that does make sense, and that's something that I find that is music is kind of like you were saying before, like with math, it is kind of a language of its own that you are putting down on paper. And I have to, I was just thinking here, and I realized I haven't been entirely honest. I have done some composing myself. When I was a
Cool.
teenager, Nintendo came out with a Super Mario game around the same time they came out with a Game Glove,
Mario Paint.
Mario Paint, and you could compose music in that. And I composed some pretty terrible songs in Mario Paint. So that's
I'm pretty sure I also did. I did a lot of I spent a lot of time in Mario Paint just doing orchestration where I would take the four included songs and rewrite them with different voices to make them sound better. Especially the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star one, which is literally just all the bells with the stars. Oh, that the sound just grated on me. So I went in there when I changed all the instruments. So I guess I got some younger practice at orchestration. If you want to consider Mario Paint a teaching tool, which is it's fantastic.
yeah.
Like there's probably plenty of budding artists that also use the art side of that to, as their first experience of drawing.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the thing, though, I think that you've kind of hit upon it, where you do have to, I mean, in anything in life, you want to approach it honestly. And you want to, I think we all want to think of ourselves as being better than maybe we actually are. But it's funny because we also have this imposter syndrome where when we're actually pushed on and what we can actually do, we kind of shirk back and are like, well, no, we doubt ourselves. But I think the more honest you can be with where you are and what level you're at, the more you can grow, because that allows you to see what you actually need to learn, what you actually need to do to get better at what you're trying to work on. And
Yeah,
I think that's
I agree.
fantastic. And I think
I
the
agree.
thing you were saying too with the paint, bringing in painting and the paintbrushes, there's the mixing of the paint or the medium that you're using, there's the brush strokes, there's all these different things that can tie in. And I'm assuming writing music is the same way, because you hear of all these different classical composers that have had their own personal signature that you can pick up as it goes through the song. So I'm assuming that would kind of be like your brush stroke while you're writing a piece.
Exactly.
That's
So
great.
that's
Hmm?
more complex, obviously, than just like specifically a brushstroke. But like there's a million different skills that come into play when you're writing a piece of music and when you're creating a piece of art, when you're writing a document, and like you probably are not even aware of all the minute things that you know when you sit down and write. Right? You've learned shortcuts essentially over the years, and so you know kind of what you want to say when you sit down to write. In the same way, when I sit down to write music, I kind of know what it is I'm wanting to put on the page before I even sit down to do it. Um, and there's a there's an element of creativity and expression that comes into play that affects the final output, right? The style of what I'm creating, and it's uniquely me based on my experiences and my feelings and emotions, and that comes through pretty clearly in most artwork. When you go and you look at it, you can see the artist in it.
So is this something that when you're about, because you were saying that now you're at a point where you can kind of have a melody in your head and you can put it down and more succinctly put that down as to what you want it to sound like. So is that when you go about composing your music, before we get into the actual nitty gritty, when you get into actually composing music, is that typically how you do it? Do you have, is it just like a series of notes that come into your head? Is it a melody? Is it like how big of a chunk is it? Or is it something like that you take, so you take that and you put it down on the page? Or is it something that you sometimes will just sit down and start playing around and just see what pops up? Like how do you get your inspiration and how do you figure out
Yeah,
what you want to start
absolutely.
working with?
So it's kind of a combination of all those in a lot of ways. So each one of those things you listed, in my view, are different techniques that can enable different outputs, essentially, for me in my music. So the my favorite technique and what I usually start with is I'll sit down at the keyboard and I'll noodle, like literally just playing around until I find something that I like, and I'll hit on an idea and I'll turn it into a motive. And that's where I start engaging the skills that I've learned, right? Where it's okay, how can I take this small idea, turn it into a reusable musical idea, which we usually call a motif, and then take that and turn it into like a melody or a piece. Um, and so a lot of times I have some preconceived notions when I sit down of what type of music I want to write, what kind of song, what kind of composition. And I'll use that as a sort of guide where I start with my doodling, but then I will, discover something and then I'll run with that discovery. There's a lot of improvisation involved for me at the very beginning of writing a piece, but that's only typically for me at the very beginning. Once I've narrowed down the ideas that I want to use, I'll then take those and start leaning on my skills that I've built as a composer and turn it into a full piece, right? And a lot of times that means taking an idea and developing it. You hear the word development in general used a lot with composition, especially when describing like the architecture of a piece of music, the way that it's laid out. I'll give you a really good example. The sonata form, which was super common back in the classical era, is basically an A theme or an A part, and a B part, and then a repetition of the A and the B so that you can make sure that the listener understands these are two different things and that we're going into like a piece based on these two different ideas. And then a C section, and the C section is called development because you take your original A and B themes and then you develop them. You use your various techniques that you've acquired over the years to change the music and the theme to create a more interesting musical space, essentially, for the listener. Then you typically end up back in a repetition of the A and the B. So you end up going A, B, A, B, C, which is all just variations on A and B played together in interesting, unique ways that are hopefully stylistically unique to you. And then you go back and you repeat the A and the B, and then that's the end of your piece if you're writing a sonata. And so something as simple as like the form, the architecture of a piece can really control like what you're going to write. And a lot of times you're going to use the form in order to communicate something specific. Um, but yeah, so that's just an example of a tool that can be used to basically create a final composition. But you usually are still starting from some form of ideas. Like even in a sonata form, you've got an A and a B section. Usually you can drill down into those and find individual motifs that are inside of each of those sections. And usually those are the pieces that get pulled out and are then ripe for development because they're small enough to then work with and tweak with all your various skills.
So that is something that, because I know too, you can take the A and the B, and then you can with after like within the repetition or after the repetition, you can extend them out or like just play around with the ordering of them and how long each piece is pulled out. But this really is more and more sounding like writing because it's the same thing in writing. You sit down with an idea, you have to. There's usually a plot and a subplot, so kind of an A and a B. But as you go along, you can't just start with an idea. You actually have to kind of repeat what the core concept of the story is as you go through. You have to repeat the core, what the challenges were for, say, the hero, what their the reasons why they turned down or they tried to refuse the quest in the first place, and kind of keep reminding the reader going through. And in the end, it has to circle back and make sense. It has to come back to some semblance of mirroring of the beginning ordinary world that you were starting with, right? And this sounds very similar to this, where in that sense, when you're writing, is that it is kind of the same idea that you're bringing the reader or the listener along, and then they have to, they hear it back and forth, and then in the end, it kind of repeats back to the beginning motif.
Absolutely. And for me in particular, writing is not a serial process. It's iterative. And a lot of times I know what the middle of a piece is going to sound like before I know what the beginning or the end are going to sound like. So I'll jump around. But I'll also, once I think I'm done, go back and do a polish pass, and then go back and do a polish pass. And in that sense, it's very similar to the way my wife writes her books. So I think there's probably a lot of analogous process amongst most arts when you break it down and think about it in basically take the ambiguity of creation and break it down into non-abstract pieces so that you can understand it. I think you'll find that there's a lot of similarities between the way that all artwork is created. It's just the specifics, the specific manner of writing something like a book or a poem or whatever your artifact is going to be very different than the specifics of writing a piece of music. And to that point, even when you're talking about writing a piece of music, there are many, many different ways that composers compose. So I, for example, use kind of a combination of what I hear in my head along with the notation software that I'm using or what I'm playing on the keyboard, right? So sometimes my fingers are guiding what I'm going to create. Sometimes my mind and what I'm already hearing is guiding what I'm going to create. And sometimes I'm literally doing something technical inside of the program because I don't like I know that I want to achieve a certain effect, and I know that doing something like creating a retrograde inversion will create that effect, right? So just to throw some nice music terms in there, since apparently chat's having issues with them.
Well, we've
um,
got LJ helping us out here, so that's fantastic.
yep. So, so like I use a lot of different techniques, and it's not just it doesn't all just flow from one place. But there are composers like Michael Jackson, for instance. He never wrote a note in his life on paper. He never learned how to notate, and not everybody needs to learn that. Like especially if you're talking the popular music sphere, you don't need to learn how to read or write music because you don't typically need to as a band in like a popular music area, you don't typically need to learn and play 10 different songs a day the way an orchestra would, right? Like an orchestra is going to learn a bunch of pieces, play a concert, and then next week they're going to do the same thing. Well, if you can't communicate really, really succinctly and accurately how to perform that piece, then there's no way they're going to be able to execute that. That's why music notation exists, is to enable that sort of behavior. But in popular music world, typically it's just a, oh hey, play this. You play it and you watch the other person play it, you learn it, and like so it might take you a little more time to learn because you're learning by ear or learning by watching somebody. You're not, but you never have to learn to read or write music because typically, if you're in a band, over the course of the entire lifetime of the band, you may write 100 songs, and so that's all you've ever had to learn. So you don't need the skill of reading or writing music notation. So Michael Jackson never built that skill. He literally would hear everything in his head and then would teach the parts to each of his instrumentalists directly. So they would learn and play exactly what was in his head, and he literally did all of it by ear. And that's very different than what I do. I do not hear a complete piece in my head, and I cannot teach every part by ear, or by singing to each artist that is going to perform it. So for me, that's not an effective technique, but for Michael Jackson, it was extremely effective.
I remember hearing something about that. And also to that end, isn't the concept of notation for classical music I don't know if it's the same as orchestral music, but in general classical music, the concept of notation of classical music and putting it down is kind of a Western concept for classical music. A lot of the older
Yes.
versions and the other countries, especially in the a lot of the Arabic countries, it is done by ear. It's passed down through generation. It's passed down from person to person. It's not actually like the concept of putting notes down on paper and passing something along is relatively newer common occurrence in the Western Hemisphere.
Yes, absolutely. So it is, if you're looking at music history holistically from the beginning of when we think people were actually, creating music to now, music notation really has only existed for the last 1/10 of that, maybe less. I think it's less than that. I think music is at least 30,000 years old, right? And it's been, about the 1400s or so in Western Europe is when we started seeing real notation, like a little bit earlier than the Renaissance. You start seeing basically almost indecipherable versions of notation or Gregorian chant and other types of sacred music. Um, but but you're absolutely right. It really is more of a Western concept, and never really took off in a lot of the rest of the world. But it also has become very standardized for collecting all music, not just Western music. Bela Bartok, for instance, was very famous for going around and recording the oral traditions of folk songs throughout Europe, essentially. And then he transcribed them. And a lot of those things turned into themes that were in his pieces. So, um, notation can be very valuable for collecting and cataloging oral tradition, but for sure, the oral tradition is the default way that music is communicated and passed down.
Yeah, I think it also helps with gives people the ability to grow and to develop and build off of what is there if it's been cataloged, and also allows for easier study, obviously, for that.
Dirty Dexter. That's not what I mean when I say sacred music. So I'm throwing out a whole lot of musical terms without really explaining them. So I thank you for helping out with the dictionary in the chat there, LJ. The TLDR, sacred music is music created for religion. Secular music is everything else, right? So inside of, in fact, we also divide classical or music in the academic world. They divide it into classical, quote unquote, and popular, right? So jazz and rock, all of those genres are considered popular. Whereas if you talk to a normal person on the street and you say pop music, that means something really, really specific, not an entire like cast of music, right?
Yeah.
So some of the terms I'm using are very academic in nature and are not the terms that you would use in common communication. So I apologize for that. You may need to go look it up.
Well, come on, everyone in chat. This is your opportunity to learn about classical music and
learn some new vocabulary.
Exactly. I've got a bit of an edge because I worked for a few years in the classical music industry, where I got to learn a lot of this stuff and meet a lot of these different people. But not Bartok though. I never got to meet Bartok.
Well, I mean, he was dead by the time you were around, I'm sure. So.
Details. So two questions. What would you say is the most difficult part for you to write, the beginning, the middle, or the end? And also, after you're done, are you a revisionist?
Yes, 100% revisionist. Like I said, I tend to iterate as I write. In fact, I got a good example of a piece I wrote 20 years ago that went through revisions for about 10 years before I arrived at the final version, and even that's not suitable for publishing, in my opinion. And it's actually a song, not an orchestral piece, for that matter. But I have a pretty nice recording of it, but it still is it's not professional. It's not something that I would like put on a CD or whatnot. I show it to my friends. I have one of my coworkers who's just started writing music for the first time. I showed it to him and I was like, this is bad. I think if I took another pass at it now with my skills that I've built over the years, that I could actually make it sound professional. He listened to it and he was like, well, if that's bad, I'm screwed. So I felt bad showing it to him, but it's the whole Bechdel curve. Is that what it is? Basically, it's like as you approach the apex of a skill, you start to really, really see the difference between you and like the top tier of that skill. It's like I'm very, very far away from somebody like a Hans Zimmer or John Williams, but I've definitely learned a whole lot over the years. So yes, TLDR, I do revise. I revise a lot. I continue to revise years after I've written a piece if I really like the piece, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad. Like ultimately, you really should like put a stamp on it and send it off to musicians to play. I think the most difficult part of a piece for me to write is probably the development section, actually. So for me, I have a much easier time with the creative improvisational side of composing and a lot more difficult time with the development. And part of that is that the development can a lot of times become very cerebral and I lose interest in it. It's really difficult to do really well composed development that is not cerebral, because a lot of times a music theorist is going to come behind you, take a look at it, analyze it, and be like, this is just some random set of notes. This isn't related to what came earlier in the piece at all. So, like, especially if you're trying to write something structured like a sonata, right? At that point, your development is fixed. You need to do something specific. So usually when I write music, I tend to either write something that is more free form or that is doesn't require that type of development. Theme and variations is a good example of a form that I really like, because you can literally pick something, just go creative ham with it, but you don't have to do any like super weird techniques or you don't have to develop it in ways that you wouldn't want to. necessarily just to increase runtime or balance of the piece, right? Because you literally just do a new variation, do a new variation, do a new variation. Okay, well, I'm out of ideas. Done. End of piece. Right. So, so that one's kind of fun to write for that reason alone. That being said, I I do think that part of that is inherent bias on my part. You don't necessarily have to, compose things perfectly, quote unquote. And this is one of those things that was beaten into me by academia that, when you're composing, quote unquote, it's very different from just spitting out random sounds and notes, right? You're trying to create an experience that is 100% referential so that it can be considered like tight from a compositional perspective.
A
Good
linear
example of that,
theme.
yeah, so good example of that is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? That's probably the tightest example of composition on the planet. You've got these three notes, da, 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 one repetition, da, 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 which is just a translation, essentially, or transposition. And then the entirety of the rest of that piece is built off of that idea in various um, developments of that idea. It goes into retrograde, it goes into inversion, it combines things together. You get augmentation, you get diminution, you get all those things put together in really creative ways, and you end up with this piece that's just gorgeous and all sounds like it's the same piece no matter where you are listening to it. And it's because it can all be theoretically referenced back to that original motif that it was built from. And so there's a heavy bias in academia towards encouraging composers to write in that style where don't don't be too explorative, don't be too creative. Instead, try to take something and modify it in as creative a way as possible rather than constantly creating new things inside of a piece. And there's been various pushbacks on that over the years, like especially when you get into 20th century avant-garde music, you have people that are pushing back on even the idea of key, like the Schoenberg school, essentially, and people like John Cage who are basically asking the question, "What is music?" and then writing 4 minutes and 33 seconds of rests on a page, giving it to a performer, and saying, "This is music," and then having that philosophical argument with all of academia about why it's music. So,
Well, and there is
um,
something to be said for that. When I was working in the classical music company I was working with, they would do during the festivals. They would do new music, and I remember the last festival that we had before COVID struck. One of the pieces of new music that came in, one of the performers actually was the composition was there was instruments involved with it, but then it was also, dropping books, tearing up pieces of paper, crumpling up paper, and just adding different sound profiles to add depth and to accent the notes that were being played by the various instruments.
the thing that is most interesting to me about avant-garde music and things like that is how common it's actually become as part of music in general without the public even realizing it. Like all techniques have been pulled into popular music. So a good example is a lot of electronica and dance music uses samples essentially inside of its composition and playback. And a lot of those people write by ear, right? So they pull in a sound they like, they modify the sound, and then it gets put into the piece. There's all sorts of weird sounds being sampled. So like this idea of, hey, tearing a piece of paper is an interesting sound and can be musical was really, really novel back in the 50s. And now it's literally just in half of the dance songs that you hear on the radio. So the the
Helmut Kohl
cool
was
part,
good for that.
yes. So the cool part about the classical side of composition to me is how it manages to experiment, try out new things, and then how those things end up working their way into the mainstream, more popular music.
So you're saying it's kind of the trailblazer for popular music.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So and uh, it's interesting because artists get inspiration from many, many different places. But if an artist before you does something that you like, then a lot of times you're going to try to emulate it or figure out a way to take ownership of it and make it part of your style. And so it's really cool to me to see things like that end up inside of modern music, even if it's unintentional. A lot of times what's happened is that the people making the sample libraries are really big fans of interesting sounds. And so they make sample libraries of interesting sounds. Then some other random artist will hear it and go, "Hey, that'd be cool for this sick beat I'm putting together," and pull it in, and suddenly you've got this really popular dance track that has this super esoteric sound that you never would have heard of before because some other sample library creator was a giant fan of like George Crumb or something. Like the interconnectivity is really interesting compared to the way it was like when I grew up, where there was this really, really strict divide between what was happening in popular music and what was happening in classical music. Nowadays, it feels like there's a much quicker uptake of certain things from the classical side into popular music just because of the technological improvements that have been made over the years.
That makes sense. And I do like the idea of, like we were talking about previously, of breaking the rules and of doing things differently. That's one of the things that I like to use as a reference point for that is actually, surprisingly enough, Eminem. Eminem's got a very unique sound, a very unique flow, and one of those reasons is that he's one of the only rappers that actually raps the offbeat, and that separation and creates this unique sound, this unique rhythm that he has. That is something small. It's a small twist and change that he's done, but it really sets him apart from the rest of the crowd.
And from a lyrical perspective, offbeats are actually more natural sounding from a language perspective to most listeners, even though it's harder to sing and perform.
But I want now. Earlier you mentioned that you're a revisionist and you go through it and you go through it, and then you don't put the pages or the piece into the hands of the musicians. Is that not a part of your revision? Do you not, or is it not needed to sit down with a group of musicians and say, "Hey, I need you to play this live so I can hear it," and then rip it apart myself, and have you also, as you're playing it, give me your perspective as to what needs to be torn apart and rebuilt?
So when I was younger, for sure, I did that a couple of times. But in general, I've found that to be less and less necessary as I've gotten older because of improvements in technology. I can now program things to sound the way I want into my, my various programs that I have to do this, into my DAW or into my transcribing software, and get something that is close enough to where I know whether it's going to work or not. And at the beginning of my career, when I was learning instruments and learning the capabilities of the instruments, I 100%, anytime I wrote something, needed to go and put it in front of a player and be like, "Hey, can you play this?" to figure out whether it was even possible or not. Now I just kind of intuitively know all the rules for what is playable, what is not playable from a mechanical standpoint. Now, from a does this sound good standpoint, I think I can usually approximate that with the tools that I have. So I don't necessarily need to put things in front of musicians anymore the way I needed to when I was very young. And that's really actually very cool. A lot of orchestral composers nowadays that are doing it professionally for films, a lot of them have never sat in front of an actual orchestra of live players because they've literally just downloaded an orchestra sample library and used it really effectively and professionally to create a score. So the way that you write music is just changing dramatically as technology improves.
Well, it also takes out the human element. If someone's having a bad day, if someone's off, it's there's repetition of someone not getting the part exactly the way you want it. You've got finite control over what it's going to sound like.
That's a good thing and a bad thing, right? Like the more precise your sample library is, the more like a machine it sounds. And realistically, music needs that human element in order to sound real, in order to really kind of convey that emotion. Like when an orchestra goes to play loudly, you can start hearing things like flubbed attacks essentially from brass players or from string players who end up catching the crop of their bow instead of the center. So you get a lot of character in sound from the human performance. So a sample library that is meticulously planned to remove that ends up sounding very wooden and flat, in my opinion. This is why I typically use the Spitfire libraries when I'm composing, because they literally take actual performances from their musicians and they leave in things that like slight mistonguings and whatnot, and they cover that up by having just a billion recordings of each note. Essentially, they usually have like 8 to 16 recordings of each individual sample, so that it rotates through, so your ear doesn't catch it as being repetitive or off. You just like essentially you get this little bit of color suddenly out of nowhere, and it then goes away. So those sample libraries are just incredibly well done. But yeah, for me personally, I prefer writing music down on paper and then taking that paper and putting it in front of musicians. Like, I like that I can use tools to figure out how it sounds like, but ultimately the rush for me isn't from, oh cool, I wrote a piece of music, check mark, next one. It's hearing it played, right? Like, I want to hear it, and I would love to hear it by a real orchestra. In fact, like for me, the biggest stress is actually conducting it myself. Like, I want to go and put the parts down in front, sit up on the pedestal and conduct it. Like, that's where I get the rush.
So, well, that's the ultimate goal, right? That's what you're doing. It is to have it performed, to have the piece alive, not just sitting off in a corner somewhere. But that's the thing too, is that we're not, for those of you that are with us here, we're not just talking about, we're talking about composing music. Yes, there's composing music for piano or for guitar or classic guitar, for these different things, but we're talking about orchestral composing. So when you're doing this, you're composing for more than just one instrument. You're composing for several instruments for the same piece. And that obviously adds many layers of difficulty to what you're doing. Nope, we've lost your audio, I think. One moment, chat. We have a technical difficulty where the audio is cut out. So I'll take a moment to say hello to everyone that came in. Lone Survivor, Guacamole Bill, welcome, welcome. Let's see if there's something that I can see that's going on here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Test 1, 2, 3.
Now you're back.
Okay, cool. I got you back earlier than you got me back. Yeah, sorry about that.
No
Technical
problem.
difficulties. I was gonna pull up a score so I could show you, but of course, as soon as I did that, it tried to take over my audio device, so I'm not going to be able to do it. But so you said several instruments for an orchestral piece, and that's a little bit of an understatement. I typically write for full orchestra, which is like around 100 to 104 players, and that's typically 20 plus staves of music, and a lot of different individual instruments like woodwinds and brass that you have to worry about in terms of the physical concerns, like what they can play, what they can't play, what range they can play in.
Mm-hmm. And how it all ties together. I wasn't about to jump in and say just how how intense it actually is, because that's one of the impressive parts, is that there are, so, like you said, there's so many things to take into account. Not just does it sound together, but is a good, like, will it sound proper together, but is it within the range of the other instruments? Is it within the range of human capability of what the performer can do? And there's so many nuanced details that you have to take into account when you're doing this. So how long does it take you to write a typical, without, I mean, there's obviously revisions and everything and going back through, but for just putting down the idea and getting from start to finish a first draft, how long would that typically take you?
It depends on the length of the piece. Let's see. So the last time that I did a large orchestral piece, I actually did it on stream. I was orchestrating Bloody Tears from Castlevania 2. And I was actually orchestrating the version from Castlevania 4. But in addition to like doing a strict orchestration, I also was essentially, I was actually sort of treating it like motifs and building a full piece out of it. And that was, if I remember correctly, that was probably, trying to count it up in my head, it was less than 40 hours of stream, if I remember correctly. But we didn't completely finish, so there's probably another 5 hours of work left on it. So that's about a 5-minute piece of music, full orchestra. And the first pass would probably take about 40 hours, right? After that, there is polish passes that would happen. So depending on like how precise I wanted to be, like we're talking maybe upwards of 80 hours essentially to do that for 5 minutes of music. Now I could do it much more quickly if I was writing my own thing and not orchestrating. Because I was orchestrating, essentially had to stop, listen, make sure that I transcribe parts correctly, then orchestrate, right? Whereas if I'm writing a piece that's a new composition, if I wanted to, I can choose how quickly that I write. That's basically how derivative do I want this to be. If it's very derivative, I can literally just slap notes down on the page using my knowledge from, past composition in order to knock something out very, very quickly. But if I want to be very creative and methodical and precise about it, it's going to take closer to what it would take to do a transcription. So I'd say 5 minutes of music, 40 hours is like a good estimate to start with, and then polish from there.
That's a lot of work, most definitely.
Yep.
So
It is a lot of work. So to back up a little bit, the typical film score for a Hollywood movie is going to be written in 2 to 3 months, and that's not just written. That's also going to be orchestrated, parts printed, placed in front of an orchestra, and recorded. So you typically get like 3 months or so to do all of that. So you're talking about doing probably like around an hour to an hour and a half of music. Films go through a process called spotting, where the director and the composer sit down together and they figure out what spots need music. And so typically there's not music 100% of the way through a movie. There are exceptions to that, but usually you have moments of silence and moments of music. So between like an hour to 2 hours of music getting written in 3 months. So that ends up taking, uh, you're either working a lot of overtime, which a lot of them do, or you're being very derivative. You're basically taking the existing music that's being given to you as a temp track and making small modifications to it in order to uh, keep your velocity up in order to be able to complete the score in time.
I think if you're in, like you said, with that kind of a time crunch, then even if you don't want to, that may be something that you need to rely on from time to time just to get to where you need to be.
It's the standard practice in the industry. Like they don't talk about it at all. If you were to talk to a film score and ask them like, how do you come up with all these awesome ideas? They would give you a very long spiel about how difficult it is to be creative and all that. But in reality, a lot of it is paying attention to the tropes of film writing. And the idea is that certain chord movements generate certain emotions, and ultimately a film score is essentially a narrative accompaniment. And so if the director is going for a certain kind of emotional feel at a certain location, well, you know from past experience what chords, what rhythms, what instrumentations evoke that emotion. And so you can lean back on those and then apply your own style and creativity to that framework in order to get what you want and also meet the director's needs. So in that sense, there's a lot of like copy pasta going on in the film industry. But at the same time, there's a lot of good opportunity to inject some of your own style and a lot of uniqueness. There's a lot of very good scoring being done right now. Ludwig Göransson, in particular, is sort of my favorite at the moment. He's just fantastically creative.
That's fantastic, and it's just it is a good point too that you're saying that there is not music all the way through, and it's a lot. People may not notice that as you're watching a movie, but it's the silent points that kind of really amplify what's happening in like a certain scene. How all of a sudden having music going through and all of a sudden there being a silent point or a silent pause can sometimes be just as amplifying as the actual sound that's racing your heart, getting yourself pulled in. That was actually one of the things that I learned how to stop being frightened at movies or for jump scares, is because you could almost always tell when a jump scare was coming because the music would start taking on a different tone. They would start following the similar pattern, and that pattern is designed, from my perspective, was designed to put your system into a state of stress, to increase your heart rate, to make you feel stressed, to put you kind of set you back a little bit. And when you can recognize the physical symptoms of that happening, then you can start preparing yourself for there's going to be a jump that's coming out.
Yeah, and so there's two ways that jump scares are typically executed in your normal horror score. One is with like a slow build, which is also a lot of times done explicitly when there's not going to be a jump scare so that it fakes you out. And then the other is with silence. So if the score completely disappears in a horror movie, time to be on the lookout for a jump scare.
So you were saying that you wanted, like, you took, you had aspirations to become a film scorer, and you pursued your degree in music composition, but due to economic realities and things, you switched gears and went into the software side of things as a software engineer. But you said that you haven't done it professionally, but you said that you've scored some things for a video game. You've scored some things. I don't know if you mentioned it tonight, but previously you said you had a couple of independent films that you did some scores for. So
Yep.
what work have you done that's out there right now?
Let's see here. So I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, which, as you know, is very, very deep south, and is the center of the civil rights movement. And there's a whole lot of cultural follow-on from that. So I grew up essentially in that environment. One of the things that's interesting about Birmingham, though, is it has a very, very strong artistic community, not just music, but also dance, also art, also filmmaking. And there's actually a big film festival in Birmingham called the Sidewalk Film Fest, and a lot of local artists will make films for that festival. And so I've scored some films that were in the festival that never did anything else other than, appear in the festival. Um, so that was an interesting experience. It was very fun. I really enjoyed it, but I didn't have um, I had limited tooling available to provide that score. So even though the director was very pleased with the score, I was not a super giant fan because I was using, my bargain basement sample library to create it. I didn't have, the money or the opportunity to go and put my music in front of live performers in order to get it recorded. Um, so I didn't get to like do the full scoring experience where you contract an orchestra, you go sit down in front of them, and you have to prepare the film with streamers is what they call them, which are essentially um, you have marks in the score that have to happen at certain times in the film for timing purposes, right? And the way you kind of accomplish that is that they'll build a streamer onto the film that you're previewing, which is essentially a line that'll go across and then end with a blip, and that'll give you a strong cue for when you're supposed to hit a certain musical moment. So I never got to have that experience where I got to conduct an orchestra to a fully cued film, which I still would love to do at some point. That would just be a lot of fun. I have written music for a video game. When I was one of the places I worked in the past was Southern Company, which is essentially a holding company for all the power companies in the Southeast. And while I was working there, I wasn't particularly happy. I started working on a side project with some friends, which was a video game. Um, so my friend basically came to me with an idea for a video game, said, I wanted to build this. I need your help. So I ended up doing a lot of the programming for it. And then I also wrote the music for it. And then it went on Kickstarter. It didn't succeed on Kickstarter for various reasons. It's Kickstarter after all. But the demo was strong. The demo was playable and functional, and that was my responsibility. And the music was okay. The music could have been better, but I didn't have very much time to write the music. Um, so I've got a couple of pieces of practical experience of creating music for other for integration with other art forms, but definitely not enough to be a professional at it. At this point, I definitely would consider myself to have a high degree of knowledge about it and a amateur curiosity.
So is this still something that is potentially in the books for in the future, or is that just something that's kind of backburnered for the time being?
I would love for it to be so long term. This is in the bio, so we talked about it a little bit. But so I'm a co-founder of Sword and Board LLC with LJ Stanton, who's in chat. She wrote an awesome book called The Dying Sun. The world that she's created is really interesting, and the reason that we created the LLC was so that I could, or both of us really, so we could own the IP and do interesting things with it. One of the things I want to do is write some music that kind of acts as impromptu score for the book. And I also would love to make a video game in the world eventually.
You just stole my question. I was going to ask you if you had ever written a score for any of LJ's books. So this is great.
Yeah.
Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, so essentially, I'd like to write some music that's like inspired by the book, essentially. And I've already got, I have a couple of sketches for pieces for that, but I don't have anything explicitly written out yet. And then I would also like to, write a video game and write the music for that. So we have some ideas of things that we would like to do, and some things that could open up opportunities for me to, get some music out there in a more professional capacity. Um, but other than doing it through Sword and Board, I don't see that as being in the cards for me. I'm not going to leave my job at Twitch, for instance, to go and make a stab at writing music for films. It's a very cutthroat industry, and you have to work your way up just like you do in any other industry. And I've spent the last 20 years of my life working my way up in software engineering. I don't really want to start over in another industry. So instead, I will try to find a sideways in if I can. If not, I'll keep writing music, and maybe one day I'll get a chance to put it in front of some orchestras and get some plays.
Well, I don't have an opening theme for my stream. Maybe that's something we should talk about.
Yeah. So,
So I do
yeah,
need to
if you
do a
want to talk
trailer
about
and other things. Yeah.
if you want to talk about opening themes to streams, 88-bit music on Twitch, fantastic composer. He used to work at Disney actually,
Wow.
where he would like all of the singers that would come in for auditions to sing for their roles for Disney movies. He was the accompanist that was on staff for Disney, so he would come in and play piano to accompany their audition.
Wow.
So he's legit, like real legit. He has way more skills than I do, and he can really like instantly without effort completely ape the style of Alan Menken, who wrote most of the golden age Disney movies, second golden age I guess they call it. I can't remember the 90s. All that music, the Aladdins and the Mulans and the Hunchbacks. He can write music that sounds just like that. He's fantastic. Definitely
Wow.
recommend to follow. And you should watch him if you can. And his opening theme is fantastic. I'll never be able to write something as awesome as that, but I could give a stab at writing you something else.
Yeah. We'll definitely we'll have to. I'm definitely going to be. We'll be talking more. And that's something I wanted to talk about too. Is the Sword and Board. This is something that came up for those of you who were here for my interview with LJ Stanton, and it's from the time that she mentioned it to me, it has stuck in my head. This is just such a fascinating concept to me that the two of you have come up with, where you've created your own LLC to maintain complete ownership of this concept, of this world that you're creating, and that kind of blows the world open, that you can do anything you want in it and really control the narrative of what is done around it and surrounding it, how far it gets expanded out, and who can enter into the world and play around with it. So yeah, do you want to tell us a little bit more about Sword and Board? This is a
Sure.
fantastic idea.
So the high level idea I think we kind of covered already, but it's really this is not a unique or new idea, to be clear. This is something that LucasArts was doing for years before we came along, and it's also something that the Pokemon company does, right? The Pokemon company literally owns the IP to Pokemon, and then makes TV shows, video games, and any other number of things, merchandise, to go along with their IP, and they just basically act as an IP holding company. That's essentially what Sword and Board is. It's an IP holding company for the Mists of Eldaruin. And it publishes her book, yes, but I don't see us as being like a full-fledged publisher. Like I'm not going out and trying to find a million different authors so that I can publish their works, right? Instead, I'm focusing on publishing her works, or potentially in the future, maybe more works from other authors that are written inside of her world, kind of similar to the Star Wars expanded universe that used to exist back before Disney bought them. So yeah, the idea is really, it's kind of about control, making sure that you have control over the destiny of the IP, but it's more about creating a cohesive vision, right? You want to be able to control the IP because it then lets you create an interesting world, and ensure that choices aren't made that diverge from the core value of that world.
That's something that's very important, as a writer, being able to keep that, like you said, the core of the world, the whole, and be able to make sure that it's not mutated or changed in any way. But you still are working in the music world, because you are working with Twitch in the music side of Twitch.
Mhm.
Which,
I am. So I so I actually came to Twitch from Curse. I was originally part of the original desktop team at Curse that built Curse Voice, which was a competitor with Discord back in the day. And Twitch acquired Curse about 5 years ago. 5 years ago in August, and I've been a Twitch employee ever since. I last year moved from the desktop organization over to the music org because there was a good opportunity for me to do so. And since then, I've been really focusing on building the soundtrack application, lead engineer for that application. And we got a whole bunch of really cool new stuff coming that I can't talk about, sadly. I can't, in general, can't talk too much about Twitch, but I will say that it has been probably the most fulfilling job experience for me in my life so far. Um, the the company operates on a set of core values that are actually kind of adhered to. Like people that you work with believe in Twitch. They believe in the values that Twitch says it believes in. We believe that we don't stop learning. We believe that we're trying to make things better for creators. And so we're very customer focused, and I like that. I've worked at a lot of places that were very project focused or deadline focused, and you don't get good results that way. You get good results by being focused on your customer and what you're building for them. And I am very lucky that I now get to work with music creators on Twitch, as a musician myself. And I get to build tools that help other creators find those music creators. Like ultimately, Soundtrack really is a way for you as a musician to compose music, put it on some place like SoundCloud, and then it just comes into Soundtrack. We put it in a playlist, and now everybody else on Twitch who is using Soundtrack can discover you as an artist through that application. And so we're hoping that we can basically drive more discovery of a lot of Twitch's music artists through the application.
sounds like that's something that I should be picking up, because I know I haven't experimented with it. I was a little frightened away at the beginning, just because when it first was released, they were talking about video on demands, and like if it was a part of a VOD, you had to be careful and this and that. So I've just to be careful, I just stopped.
So hashtag I'm not a lawyer, and nothing I say constitutes legal advice. I have to say that first. I'm also not allowed to say anything about DMCA explicitly, but there's a lot of hubbub last year about DMCA and about Soundtrack and about how it interacted with DMCA. I can talk about Soundtrack though and about how it works, which I will do. Soundtrack was basically built using brand new technology, which only works on PCs and only on some PCs, which will basically allow us to capture each audio stream from each program that's running so that we can filter out Soundtrack's music from the audio stream that goes to the Twitch Live or goes to the Twitch VOD. That way we can prevent the VOD from including music that is being used as background during your stream. That way you can stream it live, which we, are licensed to do. The whole purpose of Soundtrack is that it's rights cleared music. So it's rights cleared for live, and then the music gets removed from your VOD. So you'll have all the rest of your audio in the VOD, but no music. And that's actually really useful if you're somebody who wants to move your stuff over to YouTube, for instance. Like Twitch signing a deal with a bunch of labels doesn't suddenly sign those same deals with YouTube, right? So if we were to include that music in your VOD, and then you wanted to put that VOD on YouTube, you could end up getting a DMCA over there because you didn't have the rights to the music over on YouTube. So by creating some technology that just completely strips the music out of the VOD, we basically let you still use your VOD for YouTube or other type of content in other places. It's not the most ideal, obviously, for the creator because now sometimes you have to find music twice if you do want to reuse a video. But it's better than breaking the law.
Yeah. And the more you know. That's
Yep.
a very good explanation. I appreciate that. And I think that was you reminded me, that was the concern that I had with it, was the being a writer, having the music stripped out for the VOD is something that it's either you're just getting a lot of clicking or some dead zones or just a lot of me going, trying to figure out what to write next. So
yeah, so it's interesting because like VODs are one of those things that are really valuable to creators who use them to prop up discovery for their streams, like creators that use them to create YouTube content or use them to create clips that they share in other places. VODs are very valuable for those creators, but they're not very valuable for most other creators because not very many viewers actually watch VODs. So it's one of those things that we still want to be careful about, and like we want to make sure to not cause a DMCA against your channel, and we definitely don't want to have you take a VOD, put it somewhere else, and that get DMCA'd somewhere else and have it sourced from a Twitch application, because we're trying to do what's right for creators, not get them in trouble.
Well, and that completely makes sense, and I greatly appreciate that. And that's, I do believe in Twitch. I believe that's one of the reasons why I'm on Twitch and I'm using this platform. It's another reason why I decided to light my face in purple for our chat. But
seems like your chroma key is pulling out all of the green from you.
Yeah, well, and I didn't set up the I haven't had a chance to set up the color balance. So, and it was one of those things where I was like, yeah, it's fine. I don't need to do that. And then I wore a purple shirt.
That's all good. You figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. We're getting there. I mean, this is better than it was. But yeah, there's conversations that we'll have further, because I do need to, there's a lot of things I need to develop for my stream still. But I get what you mean. Like, that's the thing of being in with a company that you really like. Working with Plotter, I have to say, I absolutely love. It's working in the writing world, and just like you're working in the music world with Twitch, and that's something that is great to be able to do something you're passionate about, work with a company that actually cares and has a good culture with how they do things, and have all of this knowledge is bubbling up inside of you that you can't talk about because there's some really cool stuff coming that you're really excited about.
It's pretty typical. It's the same as if you were working for a video game company, right? Like, you can't say anything if you work for a video game company, and you're working on something for like 5 years at a time before it comes out. I at least only usually have to wait 3 to 6 months before I can finally talk about the thing. I can't imagine having to wait 5 years. But no, it's very gratifying. It's extremely gratifying to me because I was an active member of the Twitch music community before I moved over to the music group. So the first thing I did when I moved over was I went into all the streams of all the community members that I had, built relationships with, and said, hey, what can I do as a member of the Twitch music team to make your life better and easier? If you think of anything, let me know. So, and some people gave me some cool ideas. But it's really nice to be able to give back in a way that I couldn't do before, essentially.
Yeah, and to build in a way that, like you said, give back, and to also build something that is going to be beneficial, that is going to be not just, because it's great to have programmers that can build something, but it's even better to have people that are actually passionate and involved in the target audience of what is being built for, to be able to say, that doesn't work, this doesn't work, like, have you thought about this is kind of clunky and awkward, because you actually know how it functions and what the needs of it are. That's fantastic that you're able to do that. I'm very happy to hear.
Me too. In general, I'd say that Twitch is very much what you described. Like, they care about the creators, they care about making things better. They're not always the best at communicating, and it definitely feels like a young company that's still kind of growing and learning how to, be the best, corporate actor that it can. But I can't fault them for a lot of the mistakes that they've made.
And some of them
you learn by falling. So
well, that's it, and we pick ourselves back up. And some of the mistakes too, as far as I understand, are not entirely their fault. Not to open a can of worms, and I'm not expecting an answer from this because I know your lips are locked. But from what I understand from Twitch, when all of that DMCA stuff was happening, it's because in the beginning, when Twitch was getting strike notices, they were getting 5 or 6 or 10 a week that were coming through, or a couple hundred a week that were coming through, and they were able to deal with them. Then all of a sudden, the companies on the other side changed their methodology of how they were scanning and how they were doing things, and suddenly Twitch was being hit with 10,000 claims in a day. And that was something that, if you get hit with an avalanche, you're going to get knocked down, you need to get back up, and you're going to stumble a little bit in doing so. So I think Twitch has been doing a phenomenal job in getting them where they need to be and picking themselves back up from any stumbles that they have. So
I'm happy that Twitch seems committed to working with CSI. I can't really comment
Yeah,
beyond that.
exactly. Well, that's it. And again, don't quote me on those
But I'm
numbers,
happy.
chat. But it's don't quote me on those numbers, chat. But that is from what I understand from the emails that Twitch sent out to all of the content creators. That was the main thing, was that the amount of strike claims they were getting greatly increased all of a sudden, and there was a little bit of catch up that had to be played on that note. So
Yep. This is yep.
yeah. So at any
I
rate,
wish I could talk about it. I have so much interesting things to say about the MCA and about how it all works. But it would just get me in trouble. It would just get Twitch in trouble. If
yeah,
somebody
exactly.
would listen to this and be like, "Well, this guy said that this was true." I'm like, no.
Yeah, no, and that's something
I'm
that
not a lawyer. Don't listen to anything I say.
yeah. So let's change topics. So this is, I think we're coming to a good point where we're still going to be talking about classical music, chat. We are going to switch gears a little bit, but before we do switch gears, at the end of interviews, I like to ask a question that is a bit off the wall for people, and I try to come up with something interesting for every different person that I'm interviewing. So what I'd like to ask you, and again, not to say that this is a hard stop to the interview, because I'm sure as a conversation, things are going to bounce back and forth. At any rate, talking about streaming, we're talking about classical music, we're talking about composers, all this other fun, wonderful stuff. Which composer of old do you think would be the most successful, or the a good Twitch streamer today, if they were still around today, and why?
Yeah. So my instinct there is to say Franz Liszt. He's sort of the world's first rock star. He was renowned for, women fainting at the sight of him and stuff like that, and screaming during his performances. And these are classical performances. He gets up on stage to play a serious piano piece that was really well written, and his audience is screaming and cheering and tearing off their bodices and tossing them on stage and stuff. So like he literally was the world's first rock star. He would make a great Twitch streamer. He was very much about engaging with his audience and performing, and he was renowned for his physical beauty as well, which does not hurt on Twitch. So I'd have to go with him. There's a couple of others that would have been interesting, I think, for sure. Can you imagine like old Beethoven, like after he had gone deaf, like with his piano on the floor with a camera pointed at his face, like banging on keys?
Ear to the ground.
People would watch that just to eat popcorn and go, "What the crap is he doing?"
That's it. No, and that's the thing, is like, it's amazing to see some of the stuff. And there's actually a musician that I got to know over the years that I really like, named Rob Capello, and he does a series called What Makes It Great, where he'll take a classical piece, and tear it down. And it's great for anyone that does want to learn a little bit more about classical music. What Makes It Great with Rob Capello is a fantastic way of doing it, because he'll break down the motifs, he'll break down the repeats, and all that
podcast?
stuff. It's a podcast. He's also on it. He's an NPR host as well.
Oh.
And
I'll say the name is familiar, but I couldn't place it.
Yeah,
he probably heard him on NPR.
Probably. And he also scored the Polar Express, and did
okay.
yeah, and he also did Green Eggs and Ham. Scored Green Eggs and Ham. I think he was the first composer to score a Dr. Seuss book, not just for a movie, but actually do a score for the book.
Interesting.
So he's a very interesting person, but he's great at being able to, in layman's terms, break down one piece of music and play a little bit of it, pause it, flip back, like explain why it works, show how it ties into the next, show how it's a reversal later on, and how it ties back. And it's just a great way for people to understand how this stuff works. So
I love watching those type or listening to that type of theoretical breakdown of musical pieces. It's really, really interesting, especially not classical pieces, but modern day popular pieces using modern day theory that is new. When I was in school, in academia, learning music theory, the idea that there was theory that governed popular music was unheard of. Like, it was a travesty to even think that such a thing would exist. And now we have multiple theoreticians out there that have really good working theories about how popular music works. And it's really interesting how different it is from a theoretical standpoint than what we grew up learning, all the classical music theory that we have. But it's really cool that someone is actually spending time learning and doing that. And I love watching videos that break down the theory. One of my favorite series on YouTube is 12 Tone. He's the guy that literally does that with lots of different types of music, but with lots of popular music.
Really? And that's the thing. That is always something that's interesting to watch is, and again, I find anytime you get a chance to peek behind the curtain and see the wizard and understand a little bit of the machinations on how the wizard works is a fascinating opportunity to be able to see these things. Actually, my wife, just before I came on stream, came in or was talking to me about this site that she found that actually does the same thing, but with dialect of people. So the page that she was looking at was actually taking John Oliver and breaking down his dialect and how he talks and everything that he says, and just really not quite like Loki, where it's like, can you sign and say this is everything you've ever said in your life, but actually was like
Close enough.
Yeah, but it kind of breaks down like the behind the scenes of linguistics and dialogue and stuff, and that's something that's it's one of the reasons why I've always been fascinated by etymology and
Yep.
yeah, just peeking behind the curtains. So
History in general is something that I've learned to appreciate more and more as I've gotten older. Like understanding why something was the way it was is so much more interesting than just understanding something happened on some date, right?
yeah,
And I finally had a history teacher that taught me that lesson near the end of my college career, and it really stuck. That the interesting part about history is digging into the why.
and that is it, and it's something that gives you, there's the saying that those that don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. I've personally added on, and those that have learned the history are doomed to watch those that haven't repeated.
Yes.
Because even if you've learned the history and you learned the hows and the whys and the ins and the outs, it's still going to happen.
I think you just described the last 4 years of my life as an American.
That's, yeah, let's point in
Let's
fact.